This is our conference against evidence-based psychotherapy practice from the Critical Psychotherapy Network and Southern Association for Psychotherapy and Counselling. Now, this is a typical statement. Evidence-based practice is an idea whose time has come. Few concepts can have achieved the status of unchallengeable common sense in such a short space of time and across such a broad range of professional activity. So, indeed, we had the Review of Strategic Policy of Psychotherapy Services in England stating that the possibility of gross misapplication of technique and service errors in therapy can be reduced by ensuring that people demonstrate a commitment to evidence-based practice. So we're looking today to see, well, is such a commitment really good practice? Fortunately, there are a few people, not too many, who've written elsewhere. So one of them is John Heaton, who says it's argued that much that is important to psychotherapy is ignored in evidence-based medicine. Tradition, custom, intuition, love are all important in psychotherapy. Also, there are many sources of evidence that go beyond the positivistic notion of evidence in evidence-based medicine. So it's concluded that this evidence-based malarkey has little relevance to psychotherapy and counselling. So we'll be perhaps looking a little bit more in that direction today. It seems to be evidence-based is saying if it can't be quantified and measured, it doesn't exist. You know, and we're already getting people very much training students to use methods that can be measured. Otherwise, don't bother. Well, so at this conference today, we're putting forward that the increasing primacy given to evidence-based practice suggests that there's a crisis point being reached in what is currently taken as psychotherapeutic knowledge. There are, for example, an ever-increasing number of continuous professional development courses offering to help therapists with everything from abandonment to maternal deprivation. There's Jean's research here knows that some therapists love having some assessment. I don't like the idea of the pre-assessments, but that tells them that, yes, this client suffers from maternal deprivation. But what are you meant to do then? Sort of bottle feed them? What's the method? So could such CPD, which might be typical of psychotherapy trainings that assume some form of diagnosis and treatment, be usefully challenged? You know, if we're really to consider the three questions that I'd like to put forward. So, is to start with theory a form of violence? Should a primus be given to practice? Yeah? Is there something in practice that we can't speak of in this theoretical sort of way? And is a reliance on empirical research, which we're getting into, and our students are being trained in, getting us starting from the wrong place? Well, as I mentioned, this is a joint conference of two organisations that I'm involved with. And I'd just like to say a little bit about them. The first is the Critical Psychotherapy Network. We have a manifesto which states we must resist threats to providing a therapeutic confidential space. It's our ethical duty to challenge these threats, but we can only do this with support from one another. There's just increasing threats to this confidential space from legal aspects, from certain elements of safeguarding, of prevent, and now, of course, with COVID. You know, so I had a therapist contacting me this week saying that his local authority has asked him to put outside that his clients have to sign in, giving their names, address, and details before entering the room to them. There's also another aspect is that the training of talking therapists must include things like sociology, philosophy, anthropology, the arts, and political economy. Don't we need to develop our trainee skills to observe and deconstruct ideologies, including our own? You know, we could even end up providing a form of education. So we also mustn't be suggested by methodologies that simply don't fit with what we do. We need to find new ways of providing testimonials to ourselves, our colleagues, and the public. And hence, one of the hopes is this conference is moving in that direction. We must be wary of state interventions and psychiatric sort of classification systems which threaten pluralism and the client's right to create a therapeutic space that works for them. We must also, in our own training, look at ourselves, things like our own sexuality and violence, so we can help others with theirs. Importantly, we suggest we need to recognise the cult of individualism and how that can create suffering and overshadow the common good. We need to work actively around and outside the consulting room to inform and challenge public policy and discourse. And thinking about this, really, these kind of things should be in our future trainings. Well, that's the manifesto of Critical Psychotherapy Networks. The program is also being run by SAFPAC, and SAFPAC is the training organisation whose clinical members and students are presenting their ideas with regard to evidence-based practice and an existential analytic critical psychotherapy. The organisation is started in Wimbledon in the 1970s, and after spending time at the University of Surrey and Roehampton, has ended back in leafy Wimbledon, but albeit on Zoom. I ought to just say the critical part of it is we're moving towards the kind of elements that are in that Critical Psychotherapy Network manifesto. And the existential is helping people look at their experiences, what things mean to them, but not necessarily being holed up in some 1950s modernistic straitjacket. Surely there's ways of exploring those things without having necessarily to do that. And the analytic is not only existential analytic, but also is looking at psychoanalytic, but always starting with existentialism. It's an existential analytic and not an analytic existential approach. So our conference is against evidence-based psychotherapeutic practice. However, our prime focus today is not to detail arguments against randomized controlled trials, which are normally taken by some as the gold standard of evidence-based practice. We're taking it as given that even NICE at times realise that RCTs don't do the job, but they're unable to come up with anything else quantifiable to replace them. I've also attempted to show elsewhere how NICE's decisions regarding aspects of psychotherapy can be seen to be primarily political. In our current culture, we seem to have become obsessed with the very narrow notions of evidence-based practice. Indeed, RCTs, in the case of psychological therapists, could be seen as perhaps a form of ritual magic, covering up both their scientific absurdity, they really are in terms of psychotherapy, ridiculous, yeah, and also covering up that we haven't got what people hope for, an appropriate scientific approach to evaluating the therapies. So perhaps our conference today is more about the nature of therapeutic knowledge. So before we look at what we might mean by evidence of love, evidence of intimacy, and what parts, if any, such aspects as culture and tradition play in our practices, I'd like to briefly explore with you in a few minutes critical existential analysis in relation to evidence-based practice. Well, a critical existential analytic psychotherapeutic perspective, at least one of them, well, I ought to say that this is an evolution of what I've previously termed post-existentialism. And this notion of post-existentialism might be where the implications of thinkers such as Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty might be considered, but together with other possibilities, such as those that argue for the privileging not just of autonomy, but being subject to, for example, ethics, subject to language, to writing, to an unconscious, with looking at possibilities of people like Levinas, Lacan, Derrida, Freud, without necessarily being totally beholden to them. So with regard to these questions that we looked at briefly previously, from a critical existential analytic perspective, the answer to all three is very much a yes. But in saying this yes, it leads to a fundamentally different approach. The marketing people might call it a different attitudinal syndrome, which might be seen in the following. So we're saying with regard to theoretical foundations, no, we don't start with those. We don't. We did a conference at the Freud Museum, which was really a therapy moving towards not having theoretical foundations. With regard to psychology, that whilst there's interesting stuff originally done by Wilhelm Wundt, trying to marry the empirical with the cultural and historical, and there's William James with his radical empiricism, the sort of particularly the Brits and the Yanks seem to not want to go there. And there's a kind of question of how much psychology undergraduates do is more a socialization process, taking them away from what they intended to do. And other than perhaps CBT, may not help them very much with regard to what I think many of us here regard as psychotherapy. There's the question of research, which we'll be looking at more, and the way in which research, students, certainly university-based programs, and increasingly other programs, have to carry out empirical research. They have to use particular research methods to do this. And it may be of help to that individual person doing the research, but it's very unlikely that the kind of way that they take different individual experiences and try and generalize from them are of help to anybody else. Another aspect that's very popular these days is for clients to have goals, but really, is that really helpful to them? I mean, what about people like Kierkegaard, who've said that objective thought, such objective thought, translates everything into results, and this helps all mankind to cheat. What about stuff like that? What about following a method? Should we be following a method? I mean, Gadamer said, if you want truth, you can't have method. At least I think that's what he said. External evaluation criteria, no. If we're going to look at psychotherapy, indeed psychology, and look at it coming out perhaps of the Greek notions of physis or physis, this is the natural, what comes out of itself. And we got to thank the Greeks for the notion that the criteria for something comes out of something itself. And unfortunately, we're moving away from that. And then what about diagnosis and treatment? Can we really diagnose and treat? Unfortunately, I think so many psychotherapy models, I think, pretend that we can diagnose and treat. I don't think we are able to do that. Perhaps we will discuss this a lot more. Do clients really know what they need? Now, this is very popular with consumerism. It's not to suggest that psychotherapists know what clients need. But this sort of marketing approach is not something that's necessarily helpful to psychotherapy. And what about this notion of a primacy to autonomy? Well, I think we're saying with the help of Levinas that autonomy is important, but perhaps heteronomy is even more important. And finally, just on this list, it could go on. What about the political, economic, social, and technological contexts? Aren't these so often the cause of people's, not always, but often the causes of people's wretchedness? Isn't there some way that psychotherapists might know more about that? Certainly on most trainings, it's not the case. Well, this kind of schema indicates, I think, a fundamental different potential implications of the approach we're going to advocate today, yeah? Which we say, we've given this title, Critical Existential Analytic Psychotherapy. Well, such approaches, and this is just one of them, obviously, can be seen as an attempt to be clear with another person about his or her meanings and experiences. This, however, doesn't the therapist have to work with each client's unique, though culturally influenced language interpretation? Further, whilst for the therapist there are such very important questions of judgment and timing, isn't psychotherapy less about acquiring new skills and more attempting to see how we can be clearer about our clients and ourselves in our beings, in our beings together? Well, I'd just like to end by saying just a little bit more of those items with regard to practice, theory and research. So we're putting forward the case for privilege in practice. Our trainees start, if they can, at the very beginning of our training with practice, not waiting a year or so. Well, it has been suggested that Freud, Klein, etc., may have tended more to discovering practices from which they've subsequently tried to construct theories. Yet most trainings expect their resulting therapists to start from a theoretical place and apply knowledge derived increasingly and more exclusively from empirical research. And what about theory? We're suggesting theory is really important, but it opens up possibilities. But theory is best when it comes to mind when working with a client, not starting with it. So it's more about implications. It's not an application. And what about research? Hasn't research in the psychotherapies moved away from thoughtful practice? Now, those who privilege practice, phenomenology could be seen as being helpful. Now, of course, there are all kinds of questions of whose phenomenology is it? Who sells Heidegger's, Merleau-Ponty's, Levinas's, Montaigne's, etc. But the problem is that we're suggesting that phenomenology with psychotherapy is being looked at more as phenomenological research, and the notion of phenomenological research is really a misnomer. So there's descriptive phenomenological psychological methods of Georgi, there's interpretive phenomenological analysis of Smith, there's heuristics of Mustaka, etc. Here, various individual counts are through these different techniques brought together in an attempt to find a common phenomena. Yet even if this is possible, can it really help other psychotherapists? This isn't really what phenomenology started as. It isn't, in other words, isn't phenomenology the research? We don't need the word research added to phenomenology. So I hope that I've introduced something of our conference today that at SAFPAC we're exploring, and as I say, this originally came out of a special issue of the European Journal of Psychotherapy and Counselling, and in that issue we were very fortunate to have 3 critiques. As I say, our interest is in existentialism, psychoanalysis, and research, particularly with regard to phenomenology. And in that special issue, we had Manu Bazzano from the University of Cambridge critiquing our work from perhaps a more existential perspective. We had Laura Schernick from the Site for Contemporary Psychoanalysis critiquing it perhaps from a more psychoanalytic perspective, and Steen Halling from the Seattle University looking at what he thinks we've done or corrupted or whatever phenomenology. Well, we're not only fortunate that to have them in that journal and in the coming book. But I think it's wonderful that all three of them are here today to explore these aspects with us. We will have we will have sessions of 20 minutes presentations with 15 minutes presentation, 5 minutes for questions from the SAFPAC therapists. We will have three presentations, critiques from Manu, Laura and Steen, which will be 20-minute presentations with 10-minute questions. We will also have some small group work after our lunch between 1:30 and 2 will be the first of our small groups, and there will also be one in the afternoon, and we'll end with the plenary. So very much welcome to our day, and we will be starting, the program will be quite interesting because we're going to start with a critique. We're going to start with a critique from Manu Pisano, but I'm now going to hand over all the way to Vladivostok to Sasha Lawrence to chair. Thank you.